Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots going on this week. So first and foremost, we've got the very latest for you in terms of those debt ceiling negotiations. As we warned last week, all the happy talk, it all fell apart, not looking good. Other options, plan B and plan C being weighed. So we will break all of that down for you as best as we can. Also, surprise, surprise, Biden caves on F-16s to Zelensky. We will show you what he was saying and what he is saying now, what Zelensky has to say on all of this. I mean, it is believable. It was actually totally predictable, and we did, in fact, predict it. So there you go. Have some new contenders jumping into the race for president on the GOP side. We'll tell you about that. Also, some big Epstein news. New questions, rumors, reporting, however you want to say it, that he may have blackmailed Bill Gates, or at least
he basically did blackmail.
That's what
it's
it
a question about whether Gates acquiesced to that or not. He claims he didn't, but he's claimed a lot of things, so we'll tell you about that.
Yes, but I think pretty revealing about what Epstein was actually up to and how he operated. We also have new details about just how ill Dianne Feinstein was as part of her shingles complications, swelling of the brain. So that could explain some of the additional confusion and difficulties that she has had. So we'll get into all of that, and also some new details about exactly the political machinations behind Nancy Pelosi in particular standing behind her. So a lot to get to there. First and foremost, though, thank you so much to all of the premium subs who signed up last week. We are getting very, very close to having that new set. We're getting pictures by the day. It is scheduled to come in and be installed. So we're super, super excited about all of
that. I mean, it's been in the works. The factory, we're getting the mock-ups and all that stuff. We'll have installation soon, and all of it will be debuted to our premium subs already. Of course, they're going to get a first look at the set, and we'll reveal some of that. Also, our plan from the very beginning was to line up big new interviews at the desk, and we're having a lot of fun. We're scheduling those actually right now, Krystal. We're going to get candidates. So the first week, our idea is in person, ideally with the candidates. If we have to go remote, we will, but we're very likely going to be able to do it for all three of our major flagship shows on the Breaking Point set, and that's what everybody is enabling. And actually, funnily enough, RFK Jr. Wants to come back on the show. So we're going to have that in our first week, hopefully. Yeah, and he has a big trip to the border scheduled. So he reached out to me, and by the way, he encouraged me to share some of our exchange with you. He said he was grateful for coming on. This is the kind of exchange I had at the dinner table every night growing up. I had fun, and I'd love to come back. So we'll get that in the works. We've got Marianne on the calendar. We've got a couple Senate candidates who want to come on as well. So we are looking at all of those things. There you go. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And, well, class act of a guy. I think that's the main takeaway. Anyway, so if you want to sign up, you can go ahead, breakingpoints.com, help this new set, the big new studio, all of that. We're prepping for 2024 in the race, which is basically full on now. We got multiple GOP candidates. Feels like 2016 all over again. But before we get to 2016, let's go back to 2011.
Yeah.
The debt ceiling.
Yeah. Oh, God, indeed. Yeah. Okay, so the very latest is that there were negotiations last week between Biden and McCarthy. It seemed like things were kind of plugging along. Maybe they were going to find some common ground. I think we raised a lot of red flags and warning signs that it was not going to be as smooth sailing as was being presented at the time. And sure enough, those talks fell apart. But we did get some comments from Biden while he was in Japan about his view of how the debt ceiling negotiations should go. And we also do have scheduled today, they are supposed to resume talks. So let's take a listen to what Joe Biden has to say.
Before I left for this trip, I met with all 4 congressional leaders, and we agreed the only way to move forward was in a bipartisan agreement. And I've done my part. We put forward a proposal to cut spending by more than $1 trillion, on top of the nearly $3 trillion in deficit reduction that I previously proposed through the combination of spending cuts and new revenues. Now it's time for the other side to move from their extreme positions, because much of what they've already proposed is simply, quite frankly, unacceptable. And so let me be clear. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects, for example, $30 billion tax break for the oil industry, which made $200 billion last year. They don't need an incentive of another $30 billion, while putting health care of 21 million Americans at risk by going after Medicaid. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects $200 billion in excess payments for pharmaceutical industries and refusing to count that, while cutting over 100,000 school teachers and assistance jobs, 30,000 law enforcement officers, jobs cut across the entire United States of America. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects wealthy tax cheats and crypto traders while putting food assistance at risk for nearly 1 million Americans.
So you can see some of how he is staking out his position, saying, look, these guys won't even put, new revenues on the table, oil subsidies to, stripping those away, any sort of closing of loopholes. They won't consider any of that. And meanwhile, they want to take away assistance from the neediest Americans. He also made some comments about one of the sort of Plan B options that has been floated by a lot, and that progressives like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others have been pushing for the president to go forward with, which is invoking the 14th Amendment, basically saying, listen, this whole debt ceiling nonsense is unconstitutional. We're going to go ahead and spend and borrow the money that we need to based on what was appropriated in Congress. Biden, not totally taking it off the table, but they've been sort of from the White House pouring cold water on that idea. Let's take a listen to what he had to say there.
I'm looking at the 14th Amendment as whether or not we have the authority. I think we have the authority. The question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed and as a consequence past the date in question and still default on the debt? That's a question that I think is unresolved.
So not saying, he's saying, listen, I think we have the authority, but in terms of it working its way through the courts, it's probably going to be challenged. I'm not sure that that's the best option. And the reporting behind the scenes also suggests that even though you do have, a number of progressive senators in particular pushing for that, the White House seems to be very nervous about actually invoking it and going that route.
The other thing is that I'm realizing, and having spoken to some of the people who are involved in this, is that one of the things with the 14th Amendment is if you were going to do it, you actually probably should do it before the expiry of the debt ceiling. Because if you try and you do it after the expiry of the debt ceiling, what ends up happening is you're going to have the crash, then you're going to have even more uncertainty. You're going to remove some of the incentive to negotiate with Kevin McCarthy and all that to come to a legal, or at least a solution that was previously accepted by the markets, and you're going to have to kick it to the Supreme Court, which then if they tank, it will go even more down, and then you have to go back to the table, and you're basically extending the painful period of markets and negotiation.
The flip side of that is, so on the 14th Amendment, the bet, if you were to invoke it, would be that the courts are more interested in protecting capital than they are siding with their partisan brethren, because obviously it's conservative, Republican Supreme Court. So if you did this beforehand, which I'm inclined to say, like if you were going to go this route, you should have just done it from the beginning and say, no, we're not negotiating. We're doing clean debt ceiling, or I'm invoking the 14th Amendment because it's my power to do. This whole thing is nonsense, and have done that from the beginning. Part of perhaps a rationale for waiting is that you actually do want that pressure to be put on the Supreme Court. So it's like, Chief Justice John Roberts, do you really want to be the dude that crashes the entire global economy? Whereas if you haven't breached the debt ceiling yet, that gives them some comfort to take the partisan side, kick it back to Congress, and not have the sort of blood on their hands of being the ones most directly causing a potential global financial catastrophe. So there are some sort of rational, logical reasons to wait. But, I am doubtful. I personally think that they should invoke the 14th Amendment. I think they should go in the direction of that, or mint the coin, or premium bonds, like one of the workarounds, because otherwise you are negotiating with economic terrorists, and you're going to be forced to do this every single time the debt ceiling comes up again and you have a Democratic president and a Republican House or Senate. So you are creating a future in which this sort of brinksmanship is going to be the norm, with potentially, again, completely catastrophic consequences, as we laid out last week. So that's why I really think what they really should have done is, when they had full control, they should have gotten rid of the debt ceiling. That was what they really should have done. But now that we are where we are, we have got to make it so that this type of brinksmanship is not the norm in Washington as it is becoming.
I was going to say probably the most foolish thing that was done was when Biden, Schumer, and Pelosi did not pass a clean debt ceiling during the lame duck. I have no idea why they didn't do it. There really was no good reason as why they shouldn't have.
They should have gotten, when they had full control, they should have gotten rid of the debt ceiling altogether.
And you know why they didn't want to do it? Because they wanted just to avoid a temporary headline before the midterms that they ended up doing pretty well in, to be like, Democrats raise the, whatever to a
Eliminate debt ceiling.
Right, to
Yeah.
Googleplex or something like that. Because you
Right.
technically need to put a number. But the idea, and actually I think the correct number, was to put a number that was so high it was effectively unprintable. And thus we would describe it
Yeah.
in such a way that it wouldn't hit home like $2 quadrillion or something like that. Anyway, look, the mistake that they made was that they didn't do it. Now they're in that position where it's done. This is basically it, and we're in it now. And Biden and McCarthy are now set to meet at some point today. Let's put this up there on the screen. This is after Krystal negotiations broke down over the weekend. The problem with the details on this, though, are very wishy-washy. Like, we're not exactly quite sure where the major sticking parts are. So we have some indication.
Yeah. So, top line, Republicans want there to be a total drop in discretionary spending in nominal terms.
Yes.
Biden has floated, okay, how about if we have a drop in spending if you account for inflation? So number one, like top line, those are very different starting points. And you also have Biden setting spending caps for 2 years. Republicans want to set them for 6 years. So you have a difference in the top line number that's quite significant. And then you have a difference in the time frame. But perhaps even trickier are some of the details here. Republicans want to actually increase military spending. Remember at the beginning they were floating like, oh, maybe we'll cut them, but no, that's not happening. They want to increase military spending. That means they have to cut even more from things that benefit, social safety net programs effectively. Obviously, that is a real problem for Biden and for the Democrats, many of whom, and not just like the furthest left, but a large chunk of whom have expressed deep unhappiness and an unwillingness to go along with a deal that would make deep cuts to those programs. So that's a major issue. You also have the fact, as I mentioned before, Republicans completely unwilling to put any sort of, closing the carried interest loophole, rolling back some of the Trump tax cuts for the richest among us, rolling back oil company subsidies. They will not put any new revenues on the table. So you just have some really pretty hard ideological differences here that are difficult to see how they're resolved. You also had former President Trump weighing in, saying basically like, don't give an inch and willing to blow up the whole thing. You have the House Freedom Caucus, who are the ones that, pushed this whole brinksmanship to start with. And it's almost like Kevin McCarthy, the hostage taker, is also being held hostage by the House Freedom Caucus. Is kind of the dynamic that's going on here. So he has to make sure whatever deal he strikes is going to be acceptable to the furthest right faction of his caucus, because otherwise his ass and his speakership is on the line here too.
This is actually something where people need to understand. McCarthy does not care either way. He probably would just do a clean debt ceiling if it was personally up to him. But that's not really what is on the table. What people don't understand is that McCarthy, even if he wanted to, could not sign a deal without the Freedom Caucus and without the Chip Roys and all of them of the world, because not only could they tank the deal, they can also tank his speakership. And actually, this is why I actually think that the current way that this is being negotiated is a mistake. McCarthy does not have the power. He only has the power over some portion of the GOP caucus. They need to get the Freedom Caucus guys, Chip Roy and all those other people who are in there, because otherwise you're going to possibly negotiate a deal which will just get killed. The other thing is that a friend was explaining to me, the way that the House has been set up under GOP rule, not only could McCarthy and all of them not be able to get their votes, they wouldn't even be able to get it out of the Rules Committee. So if people remember, GOP had to acquiesce to allowing a lot of these guys into the influential Rules Committee, which advances legislation to the floor.
Right.
They would not even let him do that. So there are multiple blocks that are basically built within that effectively between 5 to 10 members of the House are the only people who you really are negotiating with in this current exchange, at least on the Republican side. And let's look, whatever you want to say about them, I don't really agree with them on a lot, but they believe deeply ideologically we have to massively slash government spending. They actually probably are people who would be okay with the military spending cuts and all that. The negotiation compromise is they're like, as long as we get our nominal, we don't care. So then you've got the balance that you've effectively explained, where we would have an increase, right, in military spending,
right,
and then a decrease in overall other discretionary spending, which is a very, very tiny portion of government spending. And then finally, what I think is absolutely 100% dead dead and gone is the IRS. I think IRS funding is gone. I don't see any way that will possibly come to the table. And there's also probably not all of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but portions of the Inflation Reduction Act, which are dead and gone too.
Well, and here's the thing with the IRS, you say, okay, we're going to cut some of this new spending on the IRS. That actually blows up the deficit. That creates a bigger hole that you have to fill with other cuts. Why? Because money spent on additional IRS agents to go after the wealthiest, that actually increases revenue. So for every dollar you spend on IRS agents, it actually increases revenue by more than that dollar. So their, ideological crusade against this new funding of the IRS, that actually makes it so that the deficit is even worse and the debt situation is even worse. And so it necessitates additional discretionary spending cuts and makes things actually even more difficult. So that's why it's hard to see how these pieces come together. And is Joe Biden and, the other Democrats who back the Inflation Reduction Act, are they just going to stand by, watch the thing gutted? I don't know. It seems to me like maybe none of the potential outcomes seems likely to me. All of them seem like, I don't know how this is going to come together. Obviously, something is going to happen. Somehow we're going to end up, dealing with this situation. We always have in the past, at least. So fingers crossed. But today, I feel like maybe the discharge petition route maybe is the most likely, because just to remind people how that works, if you could get all Democrats and 5 Republicans to sign on to just called a discharge petition in the House for a clean debt ceiling increase or something approximating it, then you can bypass that House Freedom Caucus Stacked Rules Committee. You can bypass Speaker McCarthy. You can bring something to the floor of the House to vote on and move forward. And then, then it has to pass the Senate. And you got to get, 10 Republicans over there to go along with you as well, which is not easy either. But if you had a massive, catastrophic stock market crash, maybe that would apply enough pressure on people that they're all right, we just got to move forward with something here. We cannot afford to let the economy totally tank.
That's what I would say. I would say status quo, we're probably going to default. Most likely, I would say more than 50%. Current status quo. I think that the entire game changes when there is a default. So if there is a default, at least in name only, uncertainty in the markets, you see a 20% drop in the S&P 500, that's when people start to freak out and people's principles go out the window. But knowing these Freedom Caucus guys, haven't seen and covered these people for a while, I don't think they're going to be the first to buckle.
Well, here's the other thing.
I think Biden and the Democrats are going to be the first people to buckle, and we're going to see massive sequestration or something like that across the board.
You may be right, because the other thing is that some of these people, like, psychopathically don't really care if you lose your job and your life is ruined, as long as it's bad for Joe Biden personally. And so tanking the economy under his watch, they look at that and, well, that's too bad, but, it's bad for him politically and maybe it hands us more power next election cycle. A lot of these people are craven enough to think that way. So it definitely does put more pressure on the Democratic side, because they're in charge in the White House if you have a massive crash. So we'll see how this all goes. Let's just put this last piece up on the screen. As we mentioned before, they are set to meet. Biden and McCarthy are set to meet today. They spoke by phone on Sunday. McCarthy was upbeat, they say. He told reporters at the Capitol the call with Biden was productive and that the on-again, off-again negotiations between his staff and White House representatives are focused on spending cuts. So we'll keep you updated. And just a reminder, somewhere around June 1st is when the stuff hits the fan. So we are mere days away at this point. I think it's time for everybody to really sit up and pay attention, because as we laid out for you last week about the potential doomsday scenarios, this is nothing to mess around with.
No, certainly. I mean, it will affect everybody's retirement portfolios. It could even affect some of the banks and cause like a liquidity crisis. It could cause, there's all kinds of crazy things. Nobody knows. Nobody really has any idea how any of it would happen. And look, it's going to create extraordinary pressure. And at this point, until there is some sort of crash, I actually don't know if there will be major movement.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now. And Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us. And if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.